we begin our study this morning of Psalm 114. It's a psalm many of us know from both our seder, from Hallel. We often sing it. B'tzeit Yisrael mi Mitzrayim. With the exodus of Israel from Egypt. Again, psalms are celebratory poems, and they're meant to be sung. Many were written. Probably this psalm was written for the pilgrims coming to the Temple Mount on the holidays, all the more on Pesach, a celebration. This is a psalm of celebration in which it begins with the image of the Israelites going out from Egypt. But the image of this narrative is the rejoicing of the world. The event of liberation is of cosmic transformation. The hills and the mountains dance. The rivers reverse course. And we'll look at this imagery of how that moment of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the going out from Egypt, was a cataclysm of celebration. This psalm is written, it's only 8 verses, very tightly. 8 verses of pairs of verses, and each verse has 2 halves. And here's something quite remarkable. 2 halves that complement each other in each verse, but the second half is incomplete. It has a gap, an ellipsis, needing the first half to give the context. Benjamin Siegel, the rabbi commentator of Jerusalem, says that perhaps the poet is seeking to convey that the present is incomplete without looking back to the past for context. With that, I share this lyric psalm, and I think I'll read some of it in Hebrew as well as in English this morning, in that I mentioned how the psalms are set often to music. This psalm's Hebrew in particular is 4/4 rhythm. B'tzeit Yisrael mi Mitzrayim, Beit Yaakov me'am lo es, Haita Yehuda lekodsho, Yisrael mamshalotav. It's suitable for many melodies because of a regularity of rhythm. With that, I take the title from the opening line, and I'm doing so even more in anticipation of seders and knowing that this is the psalm for which Psalm 113 to 118 is known as Hallel Mitzrayim, these celebrations, the praise of Egypt, taking the title from this beginning with Exodus of Israel from Egypt. With Exodus of Israel from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of a foreign language, Judah became for God's holiness, Israel God's dominion. The sea saw and fled. The Jordan turned back. The mountains danced like rams, the hills like lambs. What is with you, sea, that you flee? The Jordan, that you turn back. The mountains that you dance like rams, hills like lambs. At the presence of the Supreme One, tremble earth. At the presence of the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool of water, flint into a spring of water. Now, we often look for, the framing, the inclusios. Here's something worth noting. Verse 8, the end, is the rock turning into water. That's the miracle of Rephidim, Exodus 17:1, according to Radak. Others expand it to also that account of Numbers 28, water coming from the rock. So that's the image, water from a rock. The opposite is the opening, which is Israel is going to go to freedom when the water becomes dry land. And so you have that image of transformation, water to dry, dry to water, as part of the frame. Here's an interesting kind of assonance that's also a frame. Verse 1 meets Rayim, and at the end, Hatsur Mayim in verse 8. And so there's kind of a verbal link of the opening and the closing. And with verse 1, you have mention of Jacob, Yaakov, house of Jacob, and you get Jacob in verse 7, Elohai Yaakov, the God of Jacob. And so tightly knit in terms of a frame. I mentioned that every two verses are a motif, an idea. So let's look at that, and then we'll circle back to how the second half of a verse depends on the first half. The opening, verses 1 and 2, are in the third person. It's talking about. With exodus of Israel from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of a foreign language, Judah became for God's holiness, Israel God's dominion. So that's the first topic, that of liberation and chosenness. They go together. Well, let me show you again the ellipsis. So with exodus of Israel from Egypt, you can almost say Judah became for God's holiness. See, if you take out the part B, the whole thing actually flows as well, because part B only amplifies and adds maybe some more concreteness to part A, but this entire psalm can be read as only the first halves, and it flows very nicely. With exodus of Israel from Egypt, Judah became for God's holiness, the sea saw and fled, the mountains danced like rams. That's actually clearer than the way it's written. But by having this doubling effect, what you gain is a quality of movement, of motion, of dynamic progress. And so let's look here, verse 1 with this ellipsis. With exodus of Israel from Egypt, and now a reframing, the house of Jacob from a people of a foreign language, what's missing here is the house of Jacob went out from a people of a foreign language. And the went out, the with exodus, is what you're dependent on the first half to understand. So the first half can stand on its own, but the second half of each of these verses depends for context, has missing words from the first half. Or take, for instance, this second verse. Jacob became for God's holiness. Israel became God's dominion. So haita, the became, is the part that's missing. So that's the dynamic. Now, verses, I'll come back and do some of the midrash on these verses, but now we're looking at the structure. Verse 3 through verse 6 are two couplets, right? Verse 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6. Now, instead of being in the third person, the psalmist is speaking directly in the second person. The sea saw and fled. The Jordan turned back. The mountains danced like rams, the hills like lambs. Now that is a description of what happened after the Exodus. The whole world celebrated. Nature participated as a living, active presence of the miracle of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And the image here in verse 3 and 4 is that nature too has a quality of consciousness. Now, that can also be understood poetically as a description of how the psalmist experiences the world as alive in celebration, metaphorically, an extension of his own wow exaltation, or some deal with this a little bit more literally. I'll come back to some of the midrashim, but now again to structure. And now 5 and 6, the psalmist is speaking directly to nature. First to the sea. What is with you, sea? Malacha hayam, which is kind of literal. What is with you, sea? Some will translate it, what perturbs you, sea? But we have that expression in English as well. What's with you? What bothers you so much? What is with you, sea, that you flee? The Jordan that you turn back. The Jordan as if it's reversing course. The mountains that you dance like rams. Hills, and again the ellipsis, hills that you dance like lambs. And now the last couplet is as if nature is giving the answer to the questions of 5 and 6. At the presence of the Supreme One, tremble earth. At the presence of the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool of water, flint into a spring of water. So why is it the water and the mountains respond that we have felt, that we have celebrated? Because God is so powerful that we know that we are too part of God's dominion, God's celebration. Now, there's also historic events underneath this. So, again, going to the beginning, the historical events that are being covered. The exodus of Egypt, from Egypt, and then being called to be a holy people. Now, this holiness can either be called to be a holy people, Tiyu Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, Exodus 19:6, you shall be to me a holy nation, a nation of priests. Or it can be foreshadowing that the people should be a holy sanctuary, and even foreshadowing that they will be in the land of Israel. Verses 3 and 4 are both two key events: the going out from Egypt and the coming into the promised land. So the book of Joshua will describe in chapter 3, verses 15 to 17, how the waters of the Jordan parted. And again, I'll come back in a moment to do some midrashim, but to continue with the flow and historic events. Verse 4, the mountains dancing can be understood as Mount Sinai, Exodus 19:18, a description of the earth quaking. And so this is a progression of Mount Sinai, and then being in the desert on the trek with the miracle of water flowing from the rock. And so suggestive here as well is a survey of miracles, of freedom, Sinai, and journey. And now to start again with some of the midrashim, which we've seen, is a richness to the composition. Note that this composition, unlike the others of these Hallel Psalms, does not have the word hallelujah either at the beginning or the end. I mentioned yesterday that the Septuagint, that early Greek translation, took the hallelujah at the end of Psalm 113 and put it here at the beginning of Psalm 114. In any event, the Psalms, the verses, have a life of their own as well. So let me share now the next level of reading. B'tzeit Yisrael miMitzrayim, in the going out from Egypt. Beit Yaakov me'am lo ez, the house of Jacob from a people of a foreign language. And here's the Midrash. Beis Yaakov, this came up yesterday. Beis Yaakov, Beit Yaakov, is the house of Jacob, which is understood as being the women. Exodus 19:3, that's an anticipation of the giving of the Ten Commandments. There is the command of needing to tell the people, but there's this expression, Ko tomar levet Yaakov. God says to Moses, so you shall say to the house of Jacob. And the Midrash, the Mechilta 19:3, gets picked up by Rashi, French commentator of the 11th century, to say that's in reference to women. And so here you get, in the going out from Egypt, the women folk were from a people of foreign language. And the Midrash is, the women didn't mix with the Egyptians. Hence, they didn't know how to speak Egyptian. The women were more holy than the men. And fast forwarding in time, one second. In Krakow, in 1917, Sarah Schneiderer would create the first women's academy of study. She was Misnagdish, right? And bottom line, she would call it a Beis Yaakov, taken from Exodus 19 and that 3 in the comment of Rashi, that Beit Yaakov refers to women, but it gets reinforced here of the women of a people leaving, so the house of Jacob leaving a people of a foreign language. So again, that's the ellipsis, right? The leaving. And so that refers to women. And I pause to simply honor how women only began, this is kind of remarkable, only began to have organized higher level study after World War I. A lot of changes for women. Suffragette movement after World War I in America, maybe in England as well. And so that is noteworthy. The word lo'ez, translated here as a foreign language, is a rare word in this context. The Targum Yonatan, that translation into Aramaic, translates it as barbaric. So the house of Jacob went out from a people of a barbaric language, and some of the translations, like Art Scroll, instead of using foreign or alien language, will use, based on that comment, barbaric. In modern Hebrew, lo'ez means a foreign language. Judah became for God's holiness, Israel for God's dominion. Modern Bible scholars, though it may not be necessarily the case, will point to the two words, Judah and Israel, as if it's talking after the division of the land of Israel, after Solomon's death, roughly the year 920 before the Common Era, where there is a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. So some will point to verse 2 to say that that is in reference to a time in which they are separated, not necessarily the case. Later commentators like Malbim, Russia, 19th century, he'll say Yehuda and Yisrael are the common folks and then the elite, trying to say, it's not simply being repeated, but often they can be simply for emphasis. Judah gets singled out here, and Rashi will say, why is Judah being singled out, linked to the Exodus? Because of Nachshon ben Aminadav, that famous midrash of the prince of Judah, who's the first to go into the water until it reached his nostrils, meaning one more step and he would drown. And that's when the waters parted. So Rashi picks up on that midrash to say that the Exodus here is as a result of Judah. He allowed Israel to cross. So the sea saw and fled, the Jordan turned back, and now Joseph enters in to what will unfold. First, there is a midrash. What is it that allowed the Jordan to part? And by extension, also the waters. And that is the bones of Joseph that they were carrying. And Bereshit Rabbah 87:10, that's where that midrash is found, that when they saw the bones of Joseph, they parted, in part because they didn't want the bones to get wet, as a matter of respect, the Jordan respecting the bones and the coffin, the Aron. The Tanhuma, a later midrash, would say that, here's a word play that helps prompt this. Hayam ra'ava yanos, the sea saw and fled. Yanos, that same word yanos is in the Bible in relation to Joseph. Genesis 39, verse 12. Potiphar's wife grabs his clothes as she tries to seduce Joseph. V'ya'azov bigdo b'yada, and he left his clothes in her hand. Vayanas, and he fled. The same word. Vayetze hachutza, and he went outside. And so the Tanhuma picks up on this tanus and will say, as Joseph overcame his instincts to be drawn to a beautiful woman, so the sea says, although I normally flow, I too can overcome my natural way and part. Joseph is my role model of doing the unnatural. Again, you can see how much opportunity there is to play. Verse 4, the mountains danced like rams, the hills like lambs. Malbim, that commentator who often looks for distinction making, says that mountains are large and pointed, right? Hence, they have horns. They are like rams, where hills are curved. Their ridges are curved. That's why the analogy is made to lambs in verse 6 and verse 4. The middle of all of this, the earth quaking I mentioned is Exodus 19:18. It also gets picked up in Psalm 68, verse 9, where we learn the earth quaked and heavens poured. The very middle of the psalm is verse 5, between Lecha and Hayam, or if you will, the middle phrase of this psalm, the bullseye, is Malecha Hayam. What is with you, sea? Meaning, this is a psalm about how even the sea, in fleeing, is celebrating. And it is now verse 7. It is celebrating at the presence of the Supreme One. Adon, often translated as master. I translate usually as Supreme One. It is also unique to this psalm. Namely, we have Adonai, my master for God, but according to Benjamin Siegel, it is the only time in the entire Tanakh where God is simply Adon, Supreme One. And that is a reflection here of emphasis. And we find that almost in every psalm, there'll be 1, 2, or 3 things that are unique in terms of the use of Hebrew to this poet. And here, kind of an added emphasis at the presence, melifne, from before, or at the presence of the Supreme One, chuli aretz. The word chuli, Robert Alter translates as world, picking up on the image of dancing. He chose the English word whirl. It normally, chuli means to shake or tremble. So the earth trembled. But here, again, instead of the dancing image, the trembling earth is the image of Sinai. Translators have a choice. Normally I translate melifne from before, but here I chose at the presence of the God of Jacob, emphasizing presence, who turned the rock into a pool of water. Hatsur. Chalamish is flint. The thing that's distinctive about flint is it's harder. A couple closing images. There is a midrash written in Ladino, that language of Spanish Hebrew, called Yalkut Me'am Lo'ez, very popular. It's the first book published in Ladino for the larger community of Bible commentary. It was written by Rabbi Yaakov Lo'ez in the 18th century. And here's what he does, Rabbi Lo'ez, with verse 8. He takes the Minomayim, are spigots of water. As the people, here's the midrash, as the people were crossing the Sea of Reeds, the walls of water were like flint, hard rock. But the people might have gotten thirsty with all the excitement and all the walking. Finally, they've reached water. And so out of the flint, the walls, you had spigots of water that you could drink. Creative, imaginative. One closing comment, and that is to note that James Joyce in Ulysses quotes this psalm, and he does so in the context of playing with a letter, famous letter at the time to Can Grande, tributed at that time to Dante, though that's been brought into question. But he quotes in Latin this psalm and uses it as an example of the reading on 4 levels. And I found this fascinating to see, and that is, we in the Jewish tradition say that text, Torah in particular, is read on 4 levels: pardes, pshat, remez, drash, and sod. But what I found interesting is I didn't know that there was that same image used in Christianity. And specifically, that's the case in this letter of Can Grande. And the 4 levels are understood as the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the mystical. And I did go to read it, but I couldn't print it out. And there's a kind of a Christological interpretation of the psalm using these 4 levels. So to pull it together, This psalm is short, 8 verses, and it is packed with imagery, with poetic nuance. I'm fascinated by this technique of how every verse is a doublet, creating momentum, but yet the second half is dependent on the first half for context. Again, I love the image that what is being conveyed to the celebrant is that the miracles we experienced as a people at Mount Sinai, at the going out from Egypt, at drinking the water in the desert, are miracles that show God's ability to transform nature. And that points to 2 things. One, the experience of even nature experiencing these miracles of transformation and being transformed in celebration, but more. The last verse in particular points for the traditional commentators to the future, a Messianic era, when nature will be transformed. For people, the knowledge of God will be like the waters of the sea in that future time, and more. A debate between the rabbis when it says the lion will lay with the lamb, that nature itself will be transformed to be a new nature, a nature of harmony, a nature of peace. And so in that sense, our past informs the promise of the future, of transformation to enable celebration and harmony. And so with that, a little bit different today, I'm going to turn it over to you, Irene, as our honoree and as a scholar, as a translator with a sensitivity to language, to tell us why you love Psalm 114.
Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to say what an absolute honour and pleasure it is to join this group through the Scholars Programme, which is also amazing. I'd like to pay tribute to Ari Katz and Amy Robinson as well, who I think told him that I was coming. And I'll tell you what this psalm means to me. Apart from everything else that Rabbi Spitz said, some of which I didn't know. First of all, I should have really been born not on April the 20th, but on April the 21st, like you. So I should have been a Taurus, but the doctor in those days, he was going on holiday, so he brought me forth from my mother's womb a day early. So I'm Aries, and Aries, this whole psalm and of Pesach and of skipping and of dancing and of coming out of something and something new and spring, and Pesach also meaning to skip and to leap. And the music, the tune that you hummed, which my children used to do at B'nai Akiva camp, is very light-hearted. It packs a lot in, as you said. And every birthday, Erev Pesach, I've had to rush around since I was married, doing everything, not having a proper cake until they got the kosher for Pesach, and was in this in-between stage. So I'm not going to talk about all the things you talked about. I'm going to go on a different thing, which is in 1982, we had our first holiday as a family in Israel, in Herzliya. And on April the 2nd, I had a knock on the door of the apartment where I had to clean up for Pesach, and somebody who turned out to be Moroccan, and we only spoke French in common because my Hebrew wasn't that good. She spoke Arabic, she couldn't speak English. She said to me in French, "You are at war." So I thought she was saying, "We are at war," because it was Israel and England is never at war. And it was the Falklands. It was the Falklands War that was the only thing that your president Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher didn't agree on the whole. And hold on, right. So she said, come and watch it on television. And she thought I was going to have a heart attack because we were at war. And I couldn't take it in. Because we're never at war. And the thing is, the Foreign Office is very anti-Semitic. So the Israeli TV with subtitles was very even-handed and not pro-British. It was pro-Argentinian, in my view. Then Pesach was April the 7th. And who was I seated next to at the host, who was a friend of my husband's family, was the Argentinian son-in-law. I don't know whether that was deliberate. The Argentinian son-in-law of his daughter had made Aliyah, and we got on really well. So that experience, and also the fact that there was a school in Herzliya, in the poorer part of Herzliya, preparing for teaching the kids about Pesach, and my daughter was 7, and there was a primary school age 7, and they had all about Mitzrayim on the board, you know. And I went in those days, it was very informal in Israel. I went in and I said, but you've just made peace with Egypt. How can you be talking about Egypt now? And instead of saying, how dare you and you're foreign and all that, she gave me a lesson. She said, yes, that was the Egypt then, but we've always got to realize that we've got to work with our enemies, and we've got to try and understand them. And this is what I think you're doing, and CSP, and I think that's one of the reasons that my daughter went on Aliyah as soon as she could to Israel, that she heard people saying that the Israel from Egypt, whatever that really means, it could be a psychological state, or it could be something political as well as spiritual, and we have to prepare the house and we get rid of the chametz, that they were very keen on the peace, but they also kept on doing it. And it's, you know, a friend of mine said, well, what do you think about France? And I said, not much at the moment. It's very anti-Semitic, but it saved my mother's life during the Holocaust. So this is the in-between stage of Erev Pesach, which I feel all my life I've, you know, been like, if you like, not on the fence exactly, but trying to build bridges between all the different groups. And that's what you're doing in Orange County. And I think I've said this before, that I was thrilled to read in Mosaic magazine, which is quite right-wing politically, but a very good Jewish journal online, that Orange County is now the center of Judaism as far as they're concerned, because of all your online stuff. I mean, I've taught Psalms all my life, and I've never come across a class like this. I mean, I'm actually a teacher of Psalms, and I translated them. I've worked with a partner, and I have never known anything like it with the James Joyce and the Harding and all your friends who work for the president. This is absolutely exciting, and it does demonstrate why the American Jewish community is the most flourishing, best in the world, in the diaspora. And, you know, I'd like to congratulate you. So that's what it means to me. Aries, spring, cleaning, never sitting down, always something else to do, birth being on the wrong day. I should be a nice, very diplomatic, artistic Taurian, instead of which I'm a very fiery Aries person trying to hold back. Thank you very much for inviting me on. Thank you.
It's a joy, Irene, to wish you a happy birthday in advance of Pesach, and to, you know, to celebrate with Psalm 114, which by being Erev Pesach, I can understand why it's not only identified with your birthday, but is identified with celebration, with dancing, hills and mountains, all dancing for you as well, Irene, come Pesach.